So here are some more concept check questions. You can pause the screen, try them out first before you look at the answers. Which of the following blood vessels supply blood to the right atrium? So if you look at the diagram we drew, that would be the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. Which of the following carries oxygen-rich blood? So oxygen-rich blood will be anything circled in red in the diagram we drew, and that would be the pulmonary vein. Which of the following prevents backflow of blood to the left atrium? That would be one of the AV valves, and on the left side, that is the bicuspid valve. Now we're going to talk about heart sounds. The heart makes two sounds. Typically, you can hear that with a stethoscope. The first sound is caused by the closing of the AV valve, and the second sound is caused by the closing of the semilunar valve. So when they close, it's like slamming a door. It creates a sound, and you can hear that sound from a stethoscope. Sometimes there are additional sound that you might pick up, and those additional sounds is what's called heart murmurs, and that is produced as a result of turbulent flow of blood. And typically speaking, blood flow is laminar, so it's not going to create any turbulence. But if you have any kind of backflow, for example, if you are trying to get blood through a narrow space because of buildup of plaques, for example, that could create turbulent flow, resulting in additional noises, which we call heart murmur. So heart murmur can be caused by regurgitation, which is basically what happens when your valve does not close properly. So here you have a heart valve, and if it fails to close properly, then the blood is going to squirt backwards when the ventricle contracts, and that could lead to additional sound, the heart murmur. Stenosis is the narrowing of a blood vessel. As shown here, you can see when blood is trying to go through a narrowed a vessel, then that could create turbulent flow, resulting in heart murmur. And last one, it's what's called cardiac shunt. So in fetal development, when the baby is still inside the mother, it is actually not necessary for the baby to send blood to its lungs, because the mother kind of breathes on the baby's behalf, right? The oxygen actually gets to the baby through the placenta. So in the fetal heart in development, there is a little a shunt, right? A shunt is basically something that connects two body parts that are normally not connected together. So in this case, there's a shunt that connects the aorta and the pulmonary artery, and this connection is called the ductus arteriosus. And what happens is the baby, rather than sending the blood to the lungs, they would skip that and go directly into the aorta, because again, the mother is responsible for reoxygenating the baby's blood, right? So this thing should close when the baby is delivered, but sometimes it doesn't close quick enough, and this is still connected for maybe a few days, and that create turbulent flow, and that could be picked up as a heart murmur. So one of the first thing that the nurses do when they check on the baby, the newborn, is to see if there is any kind of heart murmur, because that could indicate some kind of problem like these ones, which usually can resolve itself, but other times complication can arise, and interventions are going to be needed. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about cardiac output. Cardiac output is an indication, can be used as an indicator of how healthy an individual's heart is. So that cardiac output is dependent on two things: the heart rate and something called the stroke volume. So the heart rate is basically how many times the heart beats per minute, and the stroke volume is how much blood is released from the ventricles every time it beats. So when you multiply the two together, right, you can cancel the units here. You end up having cardiac output, which is volume per minute, which is how much blood you can circulate per minute by the heart. So let's say someone has a heart rate of 70 beats per minute, And when you multiply by the stroke volume of say 60 milliliters per beat, right? Someone with these numbers is going to have a cardiac output of 4,200 milliliters per minute. Now, is that good? Is that bad? Well, it depends on what you're looking at, right? Sometimes, if someone had a heart attack and then they recovered, their cardiac output is expected to decrease, right? So, without a benchmark number, it's hard to say whether this is good or bad. But that's how you calculate it with the heart rate and the stroke volume. So there are different things that could affect the cardiac output, right? By changing your heart rate, for example, your cardiac output is going to go up or down, right? So many things can affect your heart rate. So autonomic interventions refers to just your nervous system regulating your heart rate as needed. So for example, if you're exercising, then your heart rate goes up, right, to compensate for the demand for oxygen, and that could in turn increase your cardiac output. Hormones such as adrenaline, that could increase your heart rate. Fitness level, if you're physically fit, your heart rate might be lower, right, reducing your cardiac output. Your age, of course, plays a role as well. Things that affect your stroke volume, right? The size of your heart. Sometimes the heart, if it's bigger, it's able to pump more blood out. That might not be a good thing necessarily to have a big heart. Sometimes the heart would become bigger to compensate for reduction in function as a result of a stroke, of a heart attack rather. And you know, that's not necessarily a good thing, right? Smoking increases your heart size as well to compensate for the reduction in oxygen delivery. So all these things could increase your stroke volume and increase your cardiac output. Fitness level, gender, right, contractibility, how the ability for heart to squeeze the blood out, right? If you had a heart attack, then your contractibility would be reduced, and that could cause stroke volume to be reduced. How long does the contraction last, as well as something called preload, afterload. So basically, preload is how much blood is in the ventricles before you squeeze, and afterload is how much blood is left over after a squeeze. And if you subtract the two, then you get the stroke volume. So by changing the heart rate, changing the stroke volume, you can change the cardiac output. In the next video, we're going to talk about the cardiac cycle and rhythms. Changed my mind. Actually, we're just going to continue with the same video. So now cardiac cycle and rhythms. The cardiac cycle is basically everything that happens during one heartbeat. Okay, so the atria contracts at the same time, the left and right, they contract at the same time, and the blood's going to go into the ventricles. And after the ventricles are filled, then they would contract at the same time. So top part of the heart contracts first, and then you would have the bottom of the heart contracting next. Whenever our heart muscle contracts, we call that the systole, and during systole, the chambers are going to be emptying. Okay, so this is emptying the chambers, and when the heart is relaxing, we call that systole, and that is when the heart chamber would be filling. Okay, and the two atria will contract and relax at the same time, while the ventricles would be contracting and relaxing at the same time. But the atria will not be contracting at the same time as the ventricles. Basically, when the atria contract, the ventricles will relax, and when it's time for the ventricles to contract, then the atria will relax. So setting the pace for contraction, the heart has a special cluster of cells called the SA node, which stands for sinoatrial nodes. Okay, this is the natural pacemaker of the heart. They are responsible for spontaneously sending out rhythmical signals, or known as impulses, that would be spread throughout the heart. And whenever these electrical signals get to the heart, specific part of the heart, the chambers at those locations would contract. So the SA node is located at the right atrium where the superior vena cava comes in. So I'm just gonna switch and show you this picture, this diagram on the next page. Right, this is the superior vena cava, and this is your right atrium. So your SA node is located right here. So this will rhythmically send out signals that will spread across the heart. The higher the frequency of the signal, right, the more signals it sends per minute, the higher your heart rate is going to be. So as the signal spreads across your atria, then the two atria will contract, causing the blood to go down to your ventricles. And at the same time that the atria are contracting, the signal from the SA node will travel to another cluster of cells located right here. This is called your AV node. Okay, so the AV node, which stands for atrioventricular node, is basically a signal booster. Right? So it will take the signal from the SA node, it will give it a boost, and then it will pass it down the septum of the heart. Okay, and when the signal gets to the apex of the heart, they will travel upwards through these Purkinje fibers, which would then cause the ventricles to contract. So the signal begins at the SA node, right? It will travel to the AV node, and then it will go down the septum through the AV bundle, and then finally to the Purkinje fibers. Okay, and as the signal is traveling from the SA node to the AV node, the atria will contract. When they contract, the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve will open, causing the blood to fill up the ventricles. As the ventricles are filling up, the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve will remain closed. When the signal gets to the Purkinje fibers, then the ventricles will contract, during which the atria will be relaxing, the AV valves will close, and then the semilunar valves will open. When the conduction system fails, right, if there is some problem with this pathway, and if the problem is with the SA node, then what happens is it could lead to what we call arrhythmia. Right? Arrhythmia is basically irregular heartbeat, and in order to fix that, medication might be used, but other times you might have to implant an artificial pacemaker, which is an electrical device that will send out periodic electrical signals to tell your hearts to beat. Basically, it replaces your natural pacemaker. Electrocardiogram, or ECG, is a non-invasive way to monitor electrical signal created by the heart. So this is your typical electrical signals, the pattern that you can detect in one cardiac cycle. Right? So I'm just going to go through what each part of these mean. So here you can see the SA node is sending out signals represented by these yellow shades here, and that would spread across the atria, causing them to contract. Now your atria don't have to contract too hard because gravity is doing most of the work. They're just gonna have to squeeze a little bit so the blood will go down to the ventricles, and as such the electrical signal corresponding to the atrial contraction is not a very high peak. Okay. Then the signal will go down the AV bundle in the septum, right? So there is a little wait time before we get the ventricular contraction, and then when the signal gets to the Purkinje fibers, that creates a forceful peak, right? This big peak corresponds to the ventricles contracting. Okay, so first peak, atria contracting. This flat section, it's basically the time it takes for the signal to travel down the septum. Then we have the ventricular contraction, and the rest of it is just the heart resetting itself, which we're not going to worry about too much at this point. So you can take a look at this abnormal ECG here. You can see the ventricular contractions are very far apart, and that is what we call bradycardia, right? Your heart rate is too low. This is tachycardia when the peaks are really close. I mean, it's kind of hard to tell, I guess, without a normal ECG. But on the actual thing, there will be numbers and measurements on it for you to be able to tell. So this is tachycardia, too fast, and this is ventricular fibrillation, which is when the heart is not producing a meaningful contraction. They're just kind of quivering, and that could result in death, imminent death. And so that's what a defibrillator is for. Defibrillator will try to shock the heart and try to reset its SA note, and that way it will beat normally again. So some more questions for you to try. All right, pause the video and give it a go before you look at the answers. Which of the following is the unit for measuring cardiac output? And the answer for that would be milliliters per minute. Okay, so cardiac output is heart rate, which is beats per minute, times stroke volume, which is milliliters per beat. When you exercise, what happens to your cardiac output? Well, if you're exercising, you should increase your heart rate, and as a result, you would increase your cardiac output as well. A cardiac cycle consists of systole, which is the contraction when the chamber is emptying, and diastole, which is when the chambers are relaxing and they're filling up. Next, we're going to look at blood vessels. So there are three types of blood vessels. You probably know that by now. The arteries carries blood away from the heart, and the veins will return them to the heart, and the capillaries are kind of in between. That's where the exchange of material is going to occur. So the function of blood vessels, some are pretty self-explanatory, right? They transport blood and all its content. And at the capillary, you would carry out gas exchange, right? Depending on which capillaries you are talking about. If we're talking about the ones in the lungs, then they are going to gain O2. The blood's going to gain O2, and they're going to lose carbon dioxide. If we are talking about the systemic capillaries, the one that is throughout the body, then the blood is going to gain CO2, and then they're going to lose oxygen. The blood vessels can actually help regulate blood pressure as well. Your blood vessels can actually change size. So if we have vasodilation, which means they're going to get bigger, then you will have a decrease in blood pressure. If you have vasoconstriction, which means they're going to get smaller, that's going to increase the blood pressure. And this happens automatically. Right? Your nervous system kind of does that for you for the most part. Then they can the blood vessels can actually direct blood flow to the places that require it the most at the moment. So let's take a look at this diagram. Okay. So first of all, in this picture, you can see these are actual veins and arteries. You can see the arteries. They are thicker, right? And they are smaller in terms of diameter, right? They need to be thick to withstand the high pressure, right? So they don't rupture easily. And here in the veins, they are thinner in terms of the size of the wall, but they are larger in terms of the diameter, right? So connecting the two would be a capillary a network, and at the sort of like the entrance of the network, there are these things called precapillary sphincters. So a sphincter is like a valve, right? You can open them, you can close them. Under normal circumstances, what's going to happen is the blood will come in into the capillaries, and then they are going to fill up the entire capillaries before returning to the veins. Okay, but let's say you don't need this part. This part of the body is not very active right now. Let's say you're just sitting in your chair watching this video, so you're not really using your calf muscle, your legs muscle too much, so you don't need as much oxygen going there. So what happens is you can turn off some of these sphincters, right? And so the blood, instead of perfusing the entire capillary network, they would just go right through. Okay, so you are not supplying 100% of the blood to this location, right? You're still giving them some oxygen, right? You never want to really cut off 100% of the blood supply. That would kill the tissue. But you adjust the amount that goes through it depending on how much is required.